Okay, so we were actually supposed to have our presentation last week, but due to some logistical reasons we couldn't do it anymore. So we have prepared a YouTube presentation for you about orchestration. We will firstly talk about the UN Security Council and how they deal with orchestration. And then afterwards we will go more into depth with a case study about the Kimberley process, where we will first look at the orchestration model and then afterwards at the difficulties and the weaknesses. Well, so last week in class, Philip has told you about IGO orchestration in general and about the OIT model. The Kimberley process, what we are going to talk about, is quite an exceptional case because it is one of the few cases of orchestration in the security field where state action is substituted by the regulation of private conduct. So the Kimberley process is a case study explaining how IGOs as orchestrators can guide the behavior of states as targets, and this could also be seen as a reversal in IGO-state relations. The interaction between the Kimberley process and the Security Council eventually led to a system of state controls on blood diamonds, but we will go more into depth about that later. Well, so the Security Council normally acts through hierarchy. I think that we all know how it functions, but it is always directly imposing hard law on states in the form of, for example, resolutions, peacekeeping missions, military intervention, or sanctions. At first instance, if you think of it, it seems quite unlikely that the Security Council will engage in an orchestration relationship, because one would think that member states, that they don't allow the Security Council to handle threats to peace and security because they are too vital to be handled with an indirect relation actually. And when the Security Council doesn't, can't influence it that much and has little control. But still, however, it has increasingly engaged in partnership relations with other security organizations. And we also have found some conditions under which the Security Council engages in these relations, which are shown on the slide here as well. So the first one is when the Security Council is unable to resolve a conflict because its capacity is weak or compromised. Second one, when there are other organizations with similar interests in ending the conflict that have relevant capabilities to become intermediaries. The third condition is when the Security Council is viewed by those advocating an end to a conflict as the focal organization. When the Security Council is open to policy entrepreneurship and innovation. When the member states disagree among themselves over how to deal with the conflict, or if they disagree with that the Security Council plans to do, or expressing divergent goals. And the last condition is when the member states have weak oversight of the Security Council. Well, of course, conditions can change, and therefore one could argue that when conditions become more favorable, that there are stronger attempts made to start an orchestration relationship. So, for example, in this case, within the security field, when the capabilities of the Security Council, when they decline with regards to a specific conflict, it should try more often to find intermediaries with complementary capabilities and orchestrate with intermediaries available. This situation is also called reaching the tipping point, and we will go into depth about the Kimberley process and its tipping point later. And then the conditions become so favorable that eventually orchestrations ever succeed. Well, so this is what happened in Africa with the Blood Diamond conflicts. Although there were certainly successes in the peacekeeping missions, there were also prominent failures. And this was because the UN Security Council doesn't control the access to important sources of leverage over civil war parties. And this was very clear in the case of Angola. Eventually this resulted in the use of smart sanctions, a smart sanctions system which was set up by the UN, and therefore the decade from the 1990s until the zeros is called the sanctions decade. And in this period there were unfavorable conditions for orchestration. The sanctions were imposed for the first time in Angola in 1998, and the sanctions were targeting a rebel group who financed the war through the sale of natural resources. But unfortunately the sanction system failed because member states, they did pass all the resolutions necessary for the sanction system, but in practice they actually were unwilling to implement those sanctions effectively. So yeah, then it didn't work out. However, what was positive was that the conflict diamonds became a center of political debate, which eventually led to transnational campaigns to target the consumers of the blood diamonds. And yeah, well, of course, that it also shifted the focus from UN intervention and sanctions on rebels and governments to the role of industry in facilitating conflict. And this is when talks started about the coming into being of a more proactive role for the private sector in conflict prevention, and eventually it resulted in the cooperation between the Security Council and the diamond industry, because the diamond industry of course has the expertise and access to the industry and markets which are necessary to regulate the trade in rough diamonds. What was also important was the NGOs who played a proactive role, and they became intermediaries as well. It firstly brought the issue into the political debates in the major consumer states, and the diamond industry and the NGOs started to work together, and also they started to work with the government, which was very essential, because if it was just the industry and the NGOs, they still wouldn't reach something, but because they started to cooperate with the government, yeah, they had more access to resources, and eventually this resulted in reaching the tipping point for the establishment of an international diamond certification system, and it was in 2000 when the negotiations for the Kimberley process started. Well, so whereas the UN Security Council didn't directly involve in the negotiations of the Kimberley process, it still contributed to its success, because it started, well, of course, with setting the agenda in 1998, when it imposed targeted sanctions on diamond for the first time, and then afterwards it worked with the diamond industry to develop the first certifications of origin. Then afterwards, the UN Security Council also supported the first meeting for the discussion of an international certification system, and it also supported the efforts of the industry activists and the leading producer states to establish one. So, quickly summarizing what the exact role of the Security Council was, then we see that they had a really important role in the endorsement of the negotiations, which eventually led to the start of the Kimberley process. During these negotiations, the Security Council had an indirect role with a primary focus on facilitating consensus, although it also continued to address the issue of conflict commodities on its own when the Kimberley process began. Within the start, this is a bit like, yeah, a double agenda, it seems like, because in the start the Security Council, they still imposed sanctions on several countries, although the Kimberley process already started. An example is when they were imposing sanctions on Liberia, but what they did, which was very smart, was that they explicitly asked the Liberian government to cooperate with the Kimberley process and to implement better controls on the diamond supply chain, to eventually prevent the rough diamonds from neighboring states from crossing the border. So in this way they started to develop their own capacity to establish internal certification systems by working directly with the sanctioned governments, but directing those governments to closely cooperate with the Kimberley process. And then eventually the Kimberley process has become the sole instrument of orchestration now, monopolizing the intermediate position on the conflict diamond issue, and the issue has also moved out of the hands of the UN Security Council. So, well, while the Security Council retained its position as a focal organization for the preservation of peace, it also quickly lost its prominent role with regard to certification and regulation. And although, of course, it never abandons its peacekeeping missions and its sanctioning, it began to integrate the Kimberley process into its policy.
So as Rowana already told a lot about the UN as an orchestrator, I'm going to tell you more about the Kimberley process, and then use it as a case study to show orchestration. We had a really nice video to show you about how the Kimberley process actually works, but we will show the link. So the Kimberley process is a joint government, industry and civil society initiative against the flow of conflict diamonds. So actually it is like an orchestration model that is used to overcome the conflict diamonds issue. Governments, industry and civil society create the initiative against conflict diamonds. And this actually fits really nice into the orchestration model. We already talked about it last week in the work group, but the UN Security Council is the orchestrator. The intermediary are the diamond industry, the NGOs and the governments, and the targets are rebel armies. So via the intermediary, the UN Security Council tries to target rebel armies and help to overcome the conflict diamond issue. So we already discussed a lot about the orchestrator, the UN, and I think it's clear what blood diamonds are and the target that they are going to overcome, the UN Security Council, the intermediary. But who actually is the intermediary? So the intermediary are the diamond industry and NGOs, also the governments where the diamonds are located, but the diamond industry and NGOs are the most important ones. So when the Kimberley process started, the diamond industry was a very important aspect. The diamond industry itself wanted to join the Kimberley process because it was really helpful for them. They had the fear to lose their income because of the bloodshed and everything that surrounded diamonds, and they don't want to have a bad name. And also one of the most important corporations that was in this negotiations was the Beers. And the Beers, you can also read a really nice article on the Beers in The Economist. It came out yesterday, I saw it on Facebook. So if you want to read about that, we will send the link also. But the Beers was the most important corporation back then because it had like the monopoly on diamonds. And the Beers also feared that they would lose their monopoly power because a lot of those rebels pushed raw diamonds on the market, and therefore they lost their share. So both the rest of the diamond industry and the Beers wanted to join this negotiation and orchestration model because they wanted to do it for themselves. On the other part, we have the NGOs, Global Witness and PAC, that had a really big campaigns on the diamond industry, mostly on diamond receiving countries. So like, for example, Britain really started to think about, okay, do we actually want to take these diamonds with us? So therefore, they could really get a notice on this topic. And therefore, the turning point in this negotiation was in 2000. So to summarize actually everything, why is this orchestration model implemented in the security field, is because in 2000 the UN was used as a vocal organization by NGOs. So NGOs really wanted to put the blood diamonds on the agenda, and the UN was a sort of tool for that. And the UN actually failed to do anything about these conflicts because, Ruana already told you, they hadn't the ability to do so. And then the diamond industry actually offered itself as an intermediary, so they could offer the UN Security Council more knowledge, but also the help and the services to to get to this goal and overcome conflict. And the UN Security Council broadened this definition to peace, so also the conflict diamonds were now an issue that were related to the threat of peace. So more on a positive note, from 2000 till now, or actually from 2003 when the Kimberley process was implemented, the Kimberley process has now 54 participants, representing 81 countries, and they actually have a share of 99.8% of the rough diamond industry. That means that they are really far-reaching, and a lot of scholars argue that the Kimberley process was, in this sense, very effective because they both include the diamond industry, they also include many countries and NGOs and the UN Security Council.
Okay. So what we see now is that the Kimberley process has some weaknesses and difficulties, and one of the most important is the smuggling and trafficking in illicit stones. So as we see, like there's no effective controls from the government and its neighbors and from the regions of where the diamonds are found, and this allows like the stones to be traded between the borders without control, and this is linked with the corrupt bureaucracies that some of the countries of the diamond mines have, and corrupt bureaucrats provide Kimberley process certificates to diamonds without evidence of their origin. And after like more related to the Kimberley process in general as a process, we can see that there's a lack of organizational capacity because there's not a permanent secretariat, staff, or dedicated funding. But even though in the plenary meeting of this year that was held in Dubai about 2 weeks ago, the creation of a permanent secretariat and the establishment of a civil society fund was proposed, but it hasn't been approved. So in the following years we have to see which is the position of the different members. And another weakness of the process is the decision-making model, because now we can see like the decisions are made by consensus, and this allows a small handful of members, groups or NGOs to block solutions, and we think that maybe it could be better sometimes to allow to change the decision-making process to include decision made by simply majority to speed up the process, the decision-making process a little bit. And after one of the great difficulties of the Kimberley process is that the division between its members, because one of the main disagreements is which has to be the definition of conflict diamond, because now the definition only includes the diamonds that are from areas controlled by rebel groups, but it doesn't include the diamonds from government controlled areas. And some states and NGOs have asked for a more broader definition of the terms to include also diamonds from government-controlled areas, but where there's still violation of human rights. And it all started in 2006 when a very important diamond mine was found in Zimbabwe, and the government went to the area to control it with the military, and they provoked lots of deaths and violence in the region. So at that time, some states and NGOs asked for Zimbabwe to be kicked out of the process and its diamond to be labeled as conflict diamonds, but that didn't happen, and this provoked like some NGOs left the process because of that. And this is a division that is still going on, and this have witnessed the legitimacy of the process. And at the same, finally, we can see that there's some states have conflict of interest, because, for example, the United Arab Emirates, they control diamond trading centers, and they not always control that the diamonds that they are dealing with are from conflict-free zones. For example, in 2013, more than the 15% of the world's raw diamonds were traded to the Emirates, even that they are part of the Kimberley process. And finally, it's important to note that the Kimberley process only applies to raw diamonds, and some parts of the chain until it arrives to the consumer are not covered. So some NGOs and states have proposed to also include in the process the cutting and polishing industry, and not only the mines where the diamonds are found. So after studying all the orchestration process and the Kimberley process in particular, we can see that orchestration in security is very difficult due to all the different interests and actors that play a role. And also that when orchestration doesn't work, there's a risk of not taking sufficient action, believing that the system is working, when in fact it's not. And finally, even that we can do the debate, we will like you to give you some questions for you if you want to think about it. And is if do you think that the Kimberley process can serve as an example for other security issues? And if you think that a similar process can be proposed for other minerals like gold or coltan that in the recent years have also been in the media. And in this context, what has to be the role of consumers when orchestration fails? Like if they have any options or they just have to do it. And we hope that you like our presentation and the topic. Thank you for watching.